and it's great to see your faces. It's great to gather. Feels like a really busy time. Feels like there are issues all over the place. I think time seems to be accelerating always. We think about inflation. We think about supply chains. We think about where the economy is growing, where labor and talent are going. Pioneer thinks an awful lot about healthcare issues. And as you've seen, I think over the last few weeks, we think an awful lot on the issue of what to do about our Boston public schools. Tonight, we're not going to be dealing with that. Tonight, we want to understand what this constitutional amendment to raise taxes that's on the ballot this November, what it means. And I am really pleased to mark the release with you of this new book called Back to Taxachusetts, How the Proposed Tax Amendment Would Upend One of the Nation's Best Economies. So, Taxachusetts, it's a derogatory term from the 1980s. It's a term that really doesn't apply to Massachusetts anymore. We're about 12th in the state, 12th in the country in terms of state and local taxes. We have worked hard and modestly to reduce taxes where we can. We're at 5% on the income tax. We've raised sales taxes. We've certainly raised fees. But by and large, we've been a stable jurisdiction as regards tax policy. And given the talent that we have here has led to remarkable things, remarkable growth. This city, for anyone who was here in the early 1980s, it is dramatically changed, and the state has dramatically changed. We've created jobs at a clip that is well beyond what the entire country has, unlike some of our neighbors. This book here that we're releasing today is a distillation of about a year and a half of work, 24 studies that takes a look at some key questions. I'll get my clicker to go. So we've looked at three things principally. Who are these nebulous millionaires who are being taxed? And what types of income are being impacted by the tax? Tax policy obviously is important to competition for business and for labor, for talent. So what are the likely economic consequences? How will any revenues generated be used? And finally, what's happened to budgets in those states that have adopted similar taxes? This is an empirical study that's looked at each and every one of these questions, and we will be presenting the findings to you this evening. There are a lot of misleading statements that are out there. Things like it's only going to impact 20,000 people. People will not leave. It will not affect the labor market. Our study is trying to look at, our book is trying to look at what the reality is here. So to kick off our event tonight as we talk about this is Ed Glazer, Harvard economist, author of innumerable articles, the books called The Triumph of the City, Survival of the City, most recently this year. After Ed speaks on the broad issues related to tax policy and this issue, Charlie Cipio will come up and present a slide deck to you. In brief, 24 slides that tells you the whole story of the book. You don't have to read all of it. Please read it. It's a great book. Kevin Martin will follow him. Kevin's a remarkable lawyer from Goodwin, one of the top litigators in the state. He won before the Supreme Judicial Court in 2018 when this tax issue came up. He is again litigating under the aegis of Mass High Tech Council on the issue again this year on misleading wording that has been applied by the Attorney General that will go into voter guides. So after that, we'll have some time for Q&A. And what I'd like to do is right now invite Ed Glazer up to the podium. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you. Actually, let's leave that up. So it's great to be back here at a Pioneer event. It's great to see old friends, and it's great to be here at the launch of this book. The last time I spoke to you was for the event related to the launch of my book, Survival of the City. And one of the central themes of that book was that we were experiencing a combination of events that seemed eerily reminiscent of the 1970s. The advent of Zoom, the advent of remote work, meant that all of a sudden talent was more mobile than ever. I could not imagine a world in which high-tech entrepreneurs would suddenly decide they were going to go home to Framingham and just dial it all in. But I sure could imagine that they would all relocate to Austin, Texas because they didn't want to pay taxes, or relocate to Vail because they wanted to ski, or relocate to Honolulu because they wanted to surf. At the same time, right, before the pandemic, there was a progressive and understandable hunger to fight long-standing injustices that exist, to do something to make our cities better places of opportunity, to make sure that we did more to create usable skills, to make sure that our cities became more affordable, to make sure that they had more entrepreneurship, particularly of those people who start with less. All of these are laudable goals, but all of them require talent. They require the tax base to remain. They require a more effective government, not just increasing taxes on the rich. Right? And that was very much the theme that we tried to make in that book, was actually to make the case that this was not a moment to double down on trying to tax wealthy people in highly skilled areas. That would end up repeating the cycle of the 1970s, in which our cities were abandoned by the wealthy who suburbanized, were abandoned by firms who moved to lower cost locales, and left them, in fact, less able to care for the poor rather than more able to care for the poor. And I see very much, that moment repeating itself now. Now, I thought I would share with you, and I've only got probably 2 minutes left, for the introduction of the paperback version of the book, we did a little bit of a ranking of how metropolitan areas had fared during the pandemic. Now, this is a sort of silly and naive index, but what we have done is we've taken the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the country, and we've taken 4 different measures of how the cities are doing. Housing price growth, that's in real dollars, weekly wage growth, again in real dollars, employment growth, and the percent change in housing permits. And then we just divided them by their standard errors to get to some sort of normalization, and then we just averaged it to create an index. This is the top 25 cities on the list. You will notice the overwhelming majority of them are in the Sun Belt, right? Number 1 on the list is Austin, Texas, which makes it all the more amazing that our editor, who has no training whatsoever in economics or even statistics, managed to put Austin on the cover of our book before this came out. But Austin has had spectacular housing price growth, really robust weekly wage growth because it is both skilled and warm, and enormous growth in housing permits. Phoenix comes in second. One point I do want to heighten, because Phoenix reminds us of this, is that Phoenix and, to a lesser extent, Austin are places that make it very easy to build, okay? Phoenix permitted as many new homes last year as it did in 2005, right? 38% real price growth is unlikely to be sustainable in these areas. So just be slightly aware, but there's no question that the demand for these areas is unbelievable. There is a joker in that pack, Philadelphia. Okay, Philadelphia is only there because of a spectacular increase in housing permits, which reflects a quirk of the tax code that if you got in your permit before December 31st of last year, you were eligible for tax benefits that disappeared immediately afterwards. So discount Philadelphia. Now, here's the bottom. And at the bottom of this 25, you see a couple of Midwestern cities, Columbus, Indianapolis, right? These are actually cities that Boston should think about. Columbus is an enormously business-friendly Midwestern city. It's a city that has benefited by having the Columbus Partnership and understands that its businesses are mobile, just as they are from our metropolitan area. And it is something of a model, in fact, globally. This is the bottom 25. Now, we are not in any way towards the end of that. We've had robust housing price growth over the last 2 years, and even more remarkably, our wage growth has been really high. But that reflects the factors that Jim highlighted. That reflects the fact that we got our act together, that we are no longer TAXACHUSETTS, or at least we remain so, and that we have a very skilled, dynamic workforce. We also have benefited in terms of real estate by the rise in demand for biotechnology. Right? This has been an incredible period for our life sciences industries, which is at the center of our economy, but that need not be there for long. The remainder of this 25 are places with lots of other characteristics that are like us, and especially like us in 1978, right? Cold places, less skilled places, less dynamic places. Let's make sure that doesn't happen to us, right? Let's make sure we recognize the fragility that Boston has no natural claim to economic greatness. We have no natural asset other than cranberry box, right? We succeed by being smart, and we succeeded by having effective government that learns how to improve our schools, learns how to hypercharge entrepreneurship without trying to scare away the people who actually pay for the taxes. So with that, let me hand it over to Charlie.
Thank you, Ed. We're now going to ratchet down the IQ of the speakers a little bit. Anyway, let me try to take you through the contents of this new book. As we know, taxes, it says, impact decisions for individuals, businesses, where to locate, those kind of things. So we gain residents, we gain adjusted gross income from high tax places like New York and Connecticut and New Jersey, but we lose them, unfortunately, to a far higher degree from low tax locations like Florida and New Hampshire. So this is not going to do it on its own. I have to remember to click it, don't I? So if we look at the next page, you'll see, wait a minute, where are we? Did I hit the wrong one? We seem to be missing, are we missing this? I can skip it. I can tell you about it.
Are we missing it?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's all right. We're missing this one. Anyway,
I think it's coming up later.
I don't know. Anyway, sorry about that. This, for once, was not a tech mistake that I made, but that is a rare happening. Anyway, this next slide that is not on here is one that simply highlights that first of all, that the most losses are to Florida and New Hampshire, which are low tax states. And remember New Hampshire, because I'm going to talk a little bit about New Hampshire in a bit. So let us move to this one. So Massachusetts, clearly Massachusetts is no longer Taxachusetts, as Jim said. We've gone from 5th highest state and local tax rate in the country to down to 12th. We are still high compared to other states, but the increase is declining, thankfully, and taxes are declining. And what I want to also just sort of put in your mind is that we're going to do some comparison to Connecticut, which took a very different path, and you can see this issue of how important some of these tax issues are. So the tax hike amendment. So first thing, it's a proposed amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution, and that's important in the sense that this is not a statute. This is an amendment to the Constitution, which makes a big difference in this case. Secondly, obviously it's going to appear on the November statewide ballot, and if it's enacted, it would be the highest tax increase in the history of the state. Basically, what it would do was that it would add a 4% additional 4% levy on pretty much all annual income over $1 million. And what I would point out here, in terms of some of the things that are included, is that among the things that are included are capital gains taxes. And the reason I bring that up is because on the federal level, for example, if you capital gains income cannot push you into another tax bracket, but under this proposal, under this amendment, it would be able to push you into another tax bracket. So there you go, the additional 4%. Okay, and then, so a few of the ways that it will affect us. So it will have a particularly strong effect on pass-through businesses, partnerships, sole proprietorships, limited liability corporations. Why is this important? Well, first and foremost, it's because my little company, Chippewa Strategies, is an LLC, okay? So that's one of the reasons it's very important to me. But these companies account for 70% of all for-profit entities in Massachusetts, and almost half of the employees in Massachusetts. And you'll see here that there are these pass-through businesses. There are more than twice as many of them as there are C corporations, the kind of things that we generally think of when we think of a corporation. So, but what makes it interesting is that there are a number of taxes that apply to these pass-through companies that do not apply to corporations, to typical corporations. So what we end up with is a situation in which these mostly small businesses would actually be paying taxes at a higher rate than corporations would under the amendment. So another thing that would be happening is that we would have the highest long-term capital gains rate in New England and the highest short-term capital gains rate in the country. And so what that means is that it really becomes a tax on retirees who are selling their homes or selling their small businesses to fund their retirement. So it's very, very, very different than what what it is being sold by those who support it. Now, if you doubt the degree to which these people selling long-held assets to fund retirement is the case, then look at this next slide, which shows that out of a 10-year period, nearly half of the individuals in Massachusetts who earned $1 million or more in a given year did so only once over those 10 years. So again, this is really who this is going to hit very hard, and it is clearly not who we think of when we think of millionaires. So this is where I screwed up before. I apologize. So taxes impact location decisions, as I said. We gain from high tax states. We lose to low tax states like Florida and New Hampshire. As you can see here, although sort of in the last 30 years, Massachusetts is a far more competitive place than the old Taxachusetts days that Jim was referring to. We still have a problem in the sense that as as determined by adjusted gross income, we still lose more than we gain, and we lose a real lot of it, to two places, to Florida and to New Hampshire. And as I said earlier, I'm going to be mentioning more about New Hampshire in a second. In total, we lose about $1 billion a year in adjusted gross income. So let's talk about next what happens if we pass this amendment. What will the results of it be? So in the class I teach, I talk a lot about Connecticut. I grew up in Connecticut. My family's still there, so I tend to follow it pretty closely. So for about 15 years at the beginning of this century, Connecticut really pursued these kind of soak the rich policies. And I think it's very interesting to watch what happened. Sort of toward the end of that process in 2015, Connecticut once again raised their income tax. And when they did that in 2015, this time in 2016, the amount of tax paid by the 100 biggest taxpayers in the state went down by 45%, which really speaks to what Ed was saying a minute ago, just in terms of how mobile both people and assets are, how easily people can move, how easily people can move their assets. Would that it were so easy that we could capture this, but that is not the case. And you can see the economic consequences of what Connecticut did. If you look at this, Connecticut lost more adjusted gross income per capita than any other state, and by a lot compared to other states. DC, obviously, as you can see, was worse over this period between 2012 and 2018. So this has, as you'll see even more here, this has not exactly been a winning strategy for Connecticut. So, Gordon Gekko said greed is good. I'm not, I think I probably have a bone to pick with him on that, but growth is good. Growth has been a very good thing for Massachusetts. The lack of growth has been a very bad thing for Connecticut. They've lost marquee employers like GE and Alexion. 49th out of 50, both in terms of job growth and wage growth between 2008 and 2020. And their wage growth was half of what Massachusetts has been. So it has really taken a hit. And you can see by this next slide that you see Massachusetts has actually enjoyed growth larger, above the national average in the 2008 to 2020 period. Whereas, as you can see, Connecticut's lagged by a lot. And in fact, in 2020, Connecticut was one of 3 states that still had not recovered all the jobs lost during the Great Recession. So quite a different fates for Connecticut and Massachusetts during this period. So there are a lot of benefits to job growth and a dynamic economy. As you can see, Connecticut increased income taxes dramatically between 4.5% to about 7% from 2003 to 2018, whereas Massachusetts reduced its tax rate from 5.6 to 5.1. It's now down to 5. And if you look at what the impact of that has been, you'll see that it is not perhaps what you might think, which is that from 2008 to 2020, during that entire period, Connecticut's budget grew by 22%. Massachusetts, with its tax cuts, its budget grew by 63%. Its budget grew at almost 3 times the rate as Massachusetts did during that time. I'm sorry, 3 times the rate as Connecticut's budget did during that time. So, as I said, growth. Pretty much everybody benefits from growth, and you can see a couple of quotes here. Ned Lamont, who's the current governor of Connecticut, who's up for re-election this year, when he took office, he pursued a very different path, and he's been very clear that he does not want to go back to the path used previously. And it's interesting, this on the right, this quote from Daniel Malloy, who was his predecessor, who was really the architect of a lot of these policies. By 2017, even he was saying, we need to go down a different road with tax policy, and that's not raising taxes. So quite a change, by elected officials who are generally not eager to admit their mistakes. But you say, well, what about, isn't it all worth it? Because we're going to invest all this money in transportation and education. Well, maybe not. Kevin will be talking about this in more detail in a little bit, but in 2018, lawyers who were arguing both for and against the graduated income tax amendment agreed that it wouldn't necessarily raise a penny for education or transportation. You were probably one of those lawyers, right, Kevin, at that point? Yes, there you go. And the simple reason is this. While receipts from the tax would indeed have to go to education and transportation, there's nothing that would stop lawmakers from diverting funds that were previously dedicated to education and transportation and having those funds go somewhere else. And if you think that's unlikely, then I would point you to this next point here. When the legislature was debating this amendment in Constitutional Convention, it twice came before them amendments requiring the funding to be in addition to existing appropriations for education and transportation. Twice, those amendments went down, each time by nearly a 4-to-1 margin. So, we see what our own legislators have done. Let's look at what's happened in some other place, in another place. Now, in California, in 2012, California passed a ballot initiative to raise taxes, in this case, to fund education. So it went into effect in 2013, and what you see here is the first 9 years after this amendment in this case, ballot initiative went into effect. And what it shows us is that over 9 years, at the end of 9 years, education funding in California was still less than 1/10 of 1% above a previously adopted statutory minimum. So, another example of what tends to happen with these things. As it says, they become a blank check. So, just and so the question, of course, becomes, well, where did the money go? Well, this is what I've already told you. Where the money went was pretty simple. It didn't go to education. It went to an increase in the new amount of people employed by the state. Over this 2013 to 2020 period, Massachusetts saw its number of state employees increase 0.3%. Other 48 states and Washington, D.C. Increased by 1.8% over that time. Now, in California, 10.6% increase in the number of people employed by the state. Now, if you wonder about are they teachers, the fact of the matter is that over that period, the number of teachers in California increased by less than 0.5%. All right, so then let's talk a little bit about the timing for this event, because for this amendment, because it is a little bit of a perfect storm in a negative way for those who support it. As you can already see, we talked before about the increase in the Massachusetts state budget, far greater certainly than the increase in household income. But if we look at the Massachusetts fiscal picture, what we see is that last year we collected $5 billion more in tax revenue than anticipated. This year, as of April, we're $3.5 billion ahead of this year's benchmark. And as of the end of the next budget cycle, the Commonwealth is expected to have a rainy day fund of $6.55 billion. This does not even get to the billions of dollars in COVID relief funds that we have from the federal government currently, that Massachusetts also has access to right now. Okay, so another reason, in terms of the timing, the reason that the timing on this is particularly bad, it is not just because of the kind of mobility of jobs and of talent that Ed spoke to. That is certainly a big issue, but there are other issues as well. So we've got 13 states right now recognizing this mobility and the need to compete for jobs and talent, and they're pursuing tax cuts. 10 states have already pursued tax cuts. Among them, again, I mentioned New Hampshire before and said, remember New Hampshire. Well, New Hampshire, one of the two states to which we lose, that combined we lose 70% of our adjusted gross income to on an annual basis. About altogether, New Hampshire alone is about 25%. Well, they have already put in place. They're going to be cutting down, phasing out their income, their interest and dividends tax by 2027. So in addition to being a no income tax state, having far lower taxes than Massachusetts, they're also going to be phasing out this tax as well. So let's again look at another issue of the timing. It's not just the mobility. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act limits federal deductions for state and local tax payments to $10,000. So what that means is, in the past, when you had for people who took a big state tax hit, they could at least deduct it on their federal income taxes. Well, that is largely no longer going to be the case, and the result of it is going to be that for those who are affected by it, the graduated income tax would translate to, as I said, the individuals who are affected by it paying up to nearly 150% more in state income taxes than they would have before the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And the final thing I would say about this is very simple. What I mentioned before at the very beginning, the fact that it's not it's not a law. It's not like you can just sort of, well, it didn't work, we'll repeal it. It's in the Constitution if this passes. So what that means is the proposal would have to be approved, the proposal to repeal it would have to be approved by 2 consecutive legislatures, and then by voters in yet another statewide referendum. So at the very minimum, it would take 3 years to undo this were we to adopt it in November. And so with that, I'm going to leave you to Kevin Martin to talk about the issues of whether we're actually going to put more money into transportation and education.
That was great, Charlie. Thanks.
Thank you.
Before I get started, I have to apologize. In my day job, I'm used to getting interrupted by judges every 5 seconds with a question. And so to talk for 7 minutes without interruption, I find really difficult. That said, please do not interrupt me.
We can heckle.
So you've already heard about the economic aspects of this proposal from the prior speakers. And as noted, my job tonight is to talk about some of the legal aspects of this issue. Given its historic reputation as Taxachusetts that we've been talking about, I think it probably surprises many people to learn that our state constitution actually requires a flat income tax. Now, flat income tax is something you associate with Republican candidates for president over the last 30 years, not one of the more democratic states in the country, but there you go. That's been in our Constitution for 100 years. When a state income tax was first allowed by our Constitution, the members of the Constitutional Convention that year were wise enough to include this flat tax requirement in order to safeguard against tax the rich policies that can lead, or eat the rich policies that can drive people out of the state, as you've been hearing about from our prior speakers. Now, in Massachusetts, there have been numerous efforts over the last 100 years to get rid of that safeguard in our state constitution. 5 times, voters have been asked to allow a graduated income tax, and every single time, voters have voted it down. The last time there was an effort was back in 1994, and think about Massachusetts in 1994, not the most conservative state in the country. Only 26% of voters back in 1994 voted in favor of amending the state constitution to allow a graduated income tax. So what we've been dealing with the last 5 years is an entirely different effort to try to get a graduated income tax across the finish line. And the idea that proponents of a tax increase had was to link a graduated income tax to 2 areas of spending that would be popular with middle-class voters, education and transportation. And there was nothing subtle about this. The former Senate President Stan Rosenberg effectively admitted this to the press, saying, what makes this graduated income tax different than the prior efforts is that we're linking it to education and transportation. We're telling voters where the money will go and giving them comfort that it won't just pay for a 10% increase in state employees, that it will pay for their schools, it'll pay for roads and bridges. Now, in 2018, you've heard about a prior lawsuit that we had. This proposal first came up 4 years ago, and we kept it off the ballot that year because it was raised in the form of a citizen's petition. And in Massachusetts, citizens' petitions can only address related subjects. And so we convinced the state Supreme Court, the SJC, that having a graduated income tax for the very first time in our Commonwealth's history, and then dedicating the money to 2 particular purposes, were actually 3 different policies, and they were unrelated policies. And so the SJC agreed with us and kept it off the ballot that year. So proponents went back to the drawing board and repackaged it as a constitutional amendment coming out of the legislature, which is not subject to that same limitation. So they got past the problem we identified back in 2018, but there's this other issue, which is the subject of our lawsuit this year. And the issue is this. When you have a referendum measure going before voters, they don't see the full text of the measure. What they see is a summary prepared by the Attorney General and by the Secretary of State. The state constitution requires that summary to be nonpartisan and not misleading. It has to be a fair summary. As the state Supreme Court has characterized it, the summary must give voters a fair and intelligent conception of the main outlines of the measure, a fair comprehension of what the law will be if the measure passes, and a summary that is significantly misleading and likely to have a major impact on voters will fail that constitutional test. So what exactly is our lawsuit about? Well, the Attorney General and Secretary of State intend to tell voters on the ballot that quote, revenues from the new tax would be used, subject to appropriation by the legislature, for public education, public colleges and universities, and for the repair and maintenance of roads, bridges, and public transportation. Any ordinary voter reading about a new tax and reading that the revenues would be used for specific purposes would naturally assume that the money would be used for those purposes, that it would not be used for prisons or for redecorating the offices on Beacon Hill. That is certainly the impression that proponents of the tax want voters to have, and to support our lawsuit, we actually conducted a poll, and over 70% of voters looking at this summary understood that the language must be used for education and transportation spending. But as you've already heard, that's not accurate because money's fungible, and so the legislature can just play a shell game and move the money around. That's not just us saying that. Back in 2018, when we were arguing against the 2018 version of this, the Attorney General herself actually put that in a brief. She told the court not to worry that this was a forbidden appropriation of money through a citizen's petition, because what she told the legislature back then was, what she told the SJC back then was the legislature would retain ultimate discretion over spending choices because money's fungible. Because the proposed amendment does not require otherwise, the legislature could choose to reduce funding in specified budget categories from other sources and replace it with a new surtax revenue. That's not me saying that, that's not Pioneer saying that, that's the Attorney General saying that. The reason we filed our lawsuit is that we asked the Attorney General to put into the summary that very same clarification of the way the earmark works, and she refused. So we had to go to court, and we're now asking the SJC to require the Secretary of State and the Attorney General to provide that clarification to voters so that voters get the same understanding about how this works that the government gave the court. We'll see what happens. We argued the case on May 4th. There was one line of questioning from justices suggesting that they understand that this is misleading to voters. There was another line of questioning suggesting that ordinary voters would see this language subject to appropriation by the state legislature and understand that that means the legislature can actually appropriate it for whatever they want. I just don't think that's realistic at all. And so we'll see what the court does. They'll have to decide the case in the next month or so because absentee ballots and those voter guides you get in the mail need to be printed and mailed out. So we'll know one way or the other. But at the end of the day, whatever the court does, we've gotten some really good admissions from the Attorney General's office and from questions asked by the justices about the way this really works in practice. And if this does wind up on the ballot, or when this does wind up on the ballot in November, efforts such as this one by Pioneer to educate people about the way this really works and what the real economic consequences are will be vital. So thank you to everybody here for coming in and listening to these presentations about what the true operation of this is and what the economic stakes are for our economy. I want to end on this too, if I have 30 seconds left. We're talking about amending the state constitution here. And even putting aside the economic issues, I find it extraordinarily troubling as a citizen of the Commonwealth to think that there would be one summary of this measure given to the state Supreme Court, a different summary of this measure given to voters. If we're going to be amending the state constitution for the first time in a century to basically override 5 prior votes by voters not to have a graduated income tax, it should not be because the wool was pulled over their eyes. Just as a matter of good government, we should insist upon having fair and accurate nonpartisan summaries given to voters. And so I really do hope the SJC will do the right thing.
So we have ample time for questions for Kevin, for Ed, and for Charlie. If you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and we'll call on you. Jack.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I don't know which one of you fine gentlemen I should ask.
I'll direct it.
Okay. Will there be an advertising campaign by the people and companies and organizations who are likely against this graduated income tax that will be brought forth?
Yeah, no, I'll take that one actually, sorry. Look, Pioneer Institute is a 501c3. We're here to educate the public through facts, through fact-based research, and certainly we will be disseminating as widely as possible what you've seen in snippets. In total, we will be reaching out to a lot of trade groups and business organizations and presenting to their boards and trying to make sure that business owners actually understand. So I said at the beginning, Jack, what is amazing to me is that when I even talk to the media, they have no great grasp of what this amendment does. I've had, even as recently as 2 weeks ago, calls from very smart people in the media who've said to me, capital gains is part of this? So there's not great knowledge about what this is, and that is our job to do as much as possible. Separate from that, there is a coalition called the Coalition for a Strong Massachusetts Economy. That is a ballot committee that is completely separate from Pioneer Institute, and I'm sure they'll be using some of our information because they largely agree with what we've said here today, and they will be doing something in a very different plane. That's a different organization, however.
If you can, I will just say one thing I caught from this presentation that I think most people will understand, because that's really what you want, is I would run ads that say, if you sell your house, condominium, whatever, in Massachusetts, and this passes, you will pay, come up with some crazy number between 15 and 40% tax to the state if you vote to pass this, or your children will pay it or whatever.
Jack, given the fact that the average single home, especially in eastern Massachusetts, is in the stratosphere, it's not a crazy price. It's not a crazy price. It would be a factual price. Next question, please. Gary.
I agree, and the concept that it is what the impact, Charlie, and maybe you can address this. I think what people need to understand, what's happened.
Just speak up a
What
little.
has happened to Connecticut? How many people have left the state? What's the impact on charitable giving in that state? What is the potential impact? How many people are going to be affected in Massachusetts from this decision if it goes forward? And what, I think people want to know the kind of detail in Massachusetts, and using Connecticut as an example of what's transpired. So I'd love to hear you elaborate a little bit and hear a little more data.
Yeah. Well, look, as I said, I pay a lot of attention to Connecticut because of being from there. But yeah, what's happened in Connecticut has been absolutely devastating. And I think you see the results of it from the fact that now you have 2 consecutive Democratic governors in Connecticut basically saying, no, that was bad. We're not doing that anymore. That was not a good thing. But I mean, yeah, essentially the numbers on Connecticut are absolutely brutal. 49th in both job growth and wage growth over a 18-year period. Dramatic loss of large corporations, headquarters, marquee corporations leaving the state. Dramatic increases in income tax, only to see even more dramatic decreases in the amount of revenue coming from those income taxes. And the other interesting thing about Connecticut is that the whole thing, as often happens in state government, happened to try to deal with a fiscal crisis. And what was a cyclical fiscal crisis, early this century, really has turned into an almost 20-year ongoing fiscal crisis because of the fact that the growth kept diminishing, and that meant that the revenue kept diminishing even though taxes went up. The taxes drove people out of the state. As you saw, the biggest loser of high income taxpayers in any state in the country. It was carnage. I mean, it was terrible. And only now, and certainly with the help of some federal largesse, is Connecticut starting, after a term of taking a different approach, starting to see the first signs of recovery. So it was bad.
Gary, Charlie, I think what Gary was sort of hinting at, can sort of a projection be created that would say, okay, in 5 years, this is what the impact would be, or in 3 years,
Well,
this
yeah,
is what would
okay.
be the impact on the state.
Well, one of the things that
People, dollars lost, and then at some point, you make the case, hey, the state's not collecting any more revenue than before. In other words, it's
Well-
actually a net negative by such and such.
Well, that's right, and that, look, that's what we're trying to do here. I mean, that's the idea. we are already losing, as I said, $1 billion a year in adjusted gross income. 70% of that to Florida and to New Hampshire. New Hampshire's cutting taxes further. 13 states are thinking about cutting taxes. 10 states already have. It's pretty clear what's going to happen if this goes forward. And in terms of specific things that would happen, one of the things that Greg Sullivan, who was the author of so many of these excellent studies on this, one of the things he looked at was the more and more and more people that this would capture each year when they sold their home, when they sold their business. And one of the reasons being that they use an escalator, in terms of the inflation, but they don't use the one, for example, that legislators use to determine their salary increases. They use one that rises much slower. So the result of that, since it rises slower than household income, is that this will progressively capture more people every year.
So let's,
Ed,
go ahead.
I don't think you could do like a statistical model that would actually, have any degree of accuracy on this. But what you could just do is do the thought experiment. What if the same numbers?
I mean, you can.
Let me just finish. So what you could do is you could just say, if what happened to Massachusetts is exactly what happened to Connecticut, you would just put those numbers. And those numbers would be relatively straightforward. So you wouldn't want to tie it and say this is a clear prediction. You just want to say this is the thought experiment about how many jobs we'd lose if exactly the same thing happened to us.
It's called What's in It for Me. That's what people want to know.
So just one quick thing just to add, you also mentioned philanthropy, and what I would say is that two quick points. One is that we see more philanthropic organizations opposing this tax amendment now because we're getting closer. And I'd say the other thing is, if you look at the modeling out there, Tufts University did some modeling of what the impact would be in terms of revenue. In the beginning, folks were talking about $2 billion, and they're down to about $1.3 billion at this point because people are taking that into consideration. And Brett, you have the next question.
Funding education and transportation, if I believe the numbers and things I've read, money's not the problem, it's incompetence. And is that going to be part of the story? Throwing more money at something that's already well funded is not going to solve the intellectual people that lead these organizations and traditions in this state.
The facts are there. I think if you've seen our work on the Boston Public Schools, they're spending $26,000 per student. And we do not begrudge any of that investment. In fact, we support it if we get the effective education that we believe is necessary and constitutional, by the way. The MBTA is spending $1.9 billion a year now, every year, on upgrades. Before the control board, pioneer idea, by the way, was implemented, it was $450 million a year, and we are catching up. The T will always have its problems. BPS will always have its problems. That's life. We're human beings. So your point is well made. I don't think that's the cutting edge in terms of messaging, though, Brett, to be quite honest, to convince people. I think the issue is really, ultimately, this is truly a tax on retirees. This is truly a tax on small businesses, S-corps. That is the message that really resonates because people care about investment. We haven't even talked about the people the business we will dissuade from coming here, the entrepreneurs we will dissuade from coming here. Please, Fred.
We're talking about a message among us who have a fair understanding of the issue. And it has to do a lot of the detail of the technology. Jack, and that is, what's the message to the public? And the public impact messages, like if you sell your house. Those are the messages we need to get out of it. We can talk about the intricacies,
Of course.
all of which are correct and valid, but it's difficult for the general public to understand. Keep it simple.
Absolutely, but base it on facts. And in order to get to the simple message, you need to have all the facts so you feel like you're on firm ground and can defend every aspect of it.
Excuse me.
No worries. You carry a tuba around a lot. That's really awesome.
Speaking of facts, the proponents aren't dealing with facts.
Correct.
They're dealing with lies, and they're promoting it to people with the strength of the Commonwealth, their ability, and their voice.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be quite so kind.
Understood, Fred. Please, please.
Who are the elite legislatures relative to this? Individual legislators or just a few higher?
One more time, please.
Who are the lead legislators relative to this?
It was, what's his name again? Jason Lewis, thank you very much, was really the lead on this, and James O'Day. Frankly, we've met with, before any of this started, before it went to the ballot in June of 2021, it was voted in the legislature to move forward. Pioneer met with 63 legislators, educating them on what this issue was like, and I think what happened legislatively is essentially the Senate president felt pressure and moved before we could meet with as many people as we want to meet with and educate them on this, because some of this stuff is pretty hard to refute. So they decided to move forward with a vote as quickly as possible. I think it forced the House's hand. There's no going back at this point to the legislature. This is truly a general population educational effort that we have to undertake. Please, nice to see you, Roger.
Probably something predictable is that between now and November, there are two words that are going to be in everybody's brain between now and then, and those two words are going to be fair share. And a lot of money is going to be spent by the other side to try and promote a sort of an abstract idea of fair share. Everybody agrees. If there's any way that this campaign can reflect that back as to fair is, this is what fair is and this is what unfair is. I'm sure there's a lot of data. People are often surprised at what a slim part of any population pays 10, 20, 30, 50 times what people think is a fair share.
Completely agree. Any other questions, please? Please, Steve, one more time. We'll do these quickly because we do want to be timely.
Easily, the legislative process can actually get to a point where they would amend the Constitution, from just a practical, to a theoretical. Why now? Why hasn't it happened sooner? Kind of thing. And is there anything that protects the Commonwealth from this kind of action in the future?
No, it doesn't. And this is actually a precedential thing where if we do this, we will do more of it. I think that's true. And Kevin, I don't know if you want to add anything to that question.
Yeah, I think the point Jim just made is a great one, which is if they can get away with it this time, linking a supposed earmark to a tax increase, even though the earmark is functionally toothless, you'll just see it happen again and again. And so we'll have our state constitution littered with these supposed earmarks of tax money to specific causes that are just used to get other bad policies across the finish line.
Pamela, you get the last question. You had your hand up. Yeah.
Something was brought up here that I thought was very interesting on one of the slides that showed how much of the money actually went to education. It was only like 70. The teachers union strongly supports this, but I don't think they realize that this is what's going to happen, and what a great article to put in front of them and show them what happened in California, because to a certain extent it will get them off of this as well. So many changes.
No, but it is a good point. It is a good point. Let me just in the interest of respecting your time, and I think there are cocktails here. We have about 30 or 45 minutes. We can actually have the conversation up close. And feel free to ask questions and have conversations with the speakers. These are the experts. I just want to say thank you to all of you for being here. The book that you have has an envelope in it. The envelope is in there for a reason. The reason is that we're a 501c3. Again, I want to state that Pioneer Institute is here to do factual work and disseminate as broadly as possible, and we will. Through social media, events, meeting with business organizations, we will do all the hard work that we can do within our 501c3 status to educate the public. That's what a 501c3 does. We are not a lobbying organization, right? There is a separate organization that does that work, should you be interested. What I would say is finally, your gifts matter to us in terms of doing this work. We are going to have a muscular public education effort around this, and we will continue it right up until the decision is made. That is our mandate, and we will be doing that. Thank you very much for being here. Look forward to speaking with you.